the British Royal Guard who escorted the Gold State coach to Westminster Abbey. What happened after the journey amazed everyone. A true story, England. The alarm went off at 3:45 in the morning. Most of London was still asleep. The streets were dark and quiet, and only the distant sound of pigeons breaking from a rooftop gave any sign that the city was beginning to wake. But in a small room in the barracks at Hyde Park, a young soldier named James Whitmore was already sitting on the edge of his bed, fully alert, staring at the floor. He had not slept well, not because he was nervous about the day ahead. He had prepared for this for months, and nerves were something he had learned to manage long ago. He had not slept because of a phone call he had received the night before, at 11 minutes past 9. Just as he was setting out his uniform for the last time. His mother had been calm on the phone. That was the thing about his mother, she was always calm, even when the news was not. She told him that his father had suffered a stroke that evening, that he was in hospital, that the doctors were cautious but not hopeless, that James should know because his father would want him to know. And then she said something that stopped him cold. She said that his father, even in the hospital bed, had asked what the weather was going to be like tomorrow. James understood immediately. His father wanted to know if the procession would go well. Corporal James Whitmore was 26 years old and had served with the King's Life Guard for 4 years. He was not a tall man by the standards of the regiment, but he carried himself in a way that made him seem taller. His commanding officer had once described him, in the quietly approving language of military men, as someone who understood what it meant to show up. James had never forgotten that. His father, Robert Whitmore, was 61. He had served with the Grenadier Guards for 22 years before a knee injury ended his service. He had never talked much about those years, not in the way some veterans do, but he had kept his old photographs in a specific drawer in the kitchen, the one that no one else was allowed to open without asking. And every year on Trooping the Color, he would sit in front of the television, say very little, and watch with the focused attention of a man who was not simply watching a parade, but reading a language he once spoke fluently. James had grown up in that house. He had seen the photographs without understanding them, and then later with understanding them completely. He had joined the army the autumn after leaving school, and the day he was posted to the household division, his father had shaken his hand at the front door and said, very quietly, "Good." Nothing more. But James knew that was everything. On Coronation Day, Corporal Whitmore reported to the yard at 4 in the morning. The air was cold and smelled of damp stone and horse. The yard was already alive with movement. Grooms, officers, farriers, and soldiers moving with the focused calm of people who have rehearsed something so many times that thought is no longer required. Everything was done from memory now, from muscle, from years of practice made invisible. The Gold State coach stood at the center of it all. It was extraordinary. James had seen it before, in photographs and in the coach house at the Royal Mews, but seeing it in the half-light of early morning, freshly polished and waiting, was different. It had been built in 1762, and it weighed nearly 4 tons. It was covered in gold carving and painted panels, and it moved with a strange, creaking solemnity that made it feel like something from another century, which, of course, it was. 8 gray horses would draw it through the streets of London, and James would ride at its flank, one of the escort that kept pace with it from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey. He had been selected for this position months ago. He knew what it meant, and he had not taken a single day of preparation lightly. But standing there that morning, in the cold and the quiet before the city truly woke up, he felt the weight of the night before settle across his shoulders like something physical. His sergeant major appeared beside him. A man of few words and considerable presence, he looked at James for a moment with the kind of look that sees through rather than at a person. "Whitmore," he said. "Sir, I have been informed about your father. If you need to stand down, that is available to you. No one will think less of it." James looked at him steadily. "My father would think less of it, sir." The sergeant major held his gaze for a moment, then gave a single nod. Nothing more was said. James returned to his position, checked his equipment for the final time, and waited for the order to mount. The procession began at precisely 10 o'clock. The gates of Buckingham Palace opened, and the coach rolled forward into a city that had been building toward this moment for months. People had slept on the pavements the night before, wrapped in blankets and flags, to secure their places along the route. By the time the procession moved onto the Mall, the crowd stretched back so deep that those at the edges could not see the coach at all. They could only hear the sound of it approaching, the clip of hooves on tarmac, the distant brass of the bands, and then the rising noise of the crowd like a wave moving through the street. James rode with his eyes fixed on the line of the procession ahead. He was aware of the crowd in the way a sailor is aware of the sea, constantly, at the edge of everything, but not something he was looking at. His focus was on his position, his horse, his timing, his spacing. The procession moved at a pace that felt both measured and unstoppable, like something too large to be hurried or delayed. 47 minutes. That was how long the journey took from the palace to the abbey. In those 47 minutes, James did not shift in his saddle. He did not blink more than necessary. He did not let his hands tighten on the reins when the crowd surged or when a child near the barrier screamed with excitement and startled the horse to his left. He absorbed each moment and let it pass, the way he had been trained to do, the way his father's generation had done before him. Inside, quietly, he recited the regiment's motto. He said it to himself in the way one says a prayer, not for an answer, but for steadiness. A television camera caught him at one point during the procession, a wide shot from a crane above the street that happened to frame him perfectly against the gold of the coach behind him. In that frame, if you knew what to look for, you could see a very slight tightening of his jaw, just for a moment. And then it was gone, and his face was composed and still, and he was simply a soldier doing his duty on a day his country would remember for 100 years. The coach arrived at Westminster Abbey at 11 minutes past 10. James brought his horse to a halt at the prescribed position and executed the final salute as the coach door opened. He held it. His arm did not waver. Around him, the abbey steps were a controlled movement of dignitaries, clergy, officers, and officials, all moving with the practiced urgency of a complex plan being carried out exactly as designed. Cameras were everywhere. The world was watching. James saw none of it. He held his salute and looked straight ahead, and when the order came to stand down, he lowered his arm and let out a breath that he had not known he was holding. His duty was complete. He dismounted in the side yard and handed off his horse to the groom waiting there. His legs were stiff. His back ached from 47 minutes of perfect posture. He removed his bearskin and held it under his arm and stood for a moment in the cold November air, hearing the distant sound of bells from the abbey tower beginning to ring. A soldier appeared at his shoulder, a young private from his own unit, and pressed a folded note into his hand. James opened it. It was from his sergeant major, and it contained 4 words and an address. The 4 words were, "A car is waiting." The hospital was 30 minutes away in light traffic. In the back of the military car, James sat in his full ceremonial uniform, scarlet tunic, polished boots, bearskin on the seat beside him, and watched London move past the window. The city was still celebrating. Flags hung from windows. Small groups of people stood on corners with cups of tea, watching the procession coverage on phones. A woman outside a cafe was crying with happiness, holding her flag to her chest like a shield. James looked at her and thought about his father. He thought about the drawer in the kitchen. He thought about the handshake at the front door. He thought about what it means to belong to something that is bigger than any single person. A regiment, a tradition, a way of carrying yourself through the world that is passed down not through words but through example. His father had given him that, not through speeches or lessons, but by the way he sat in front of the television on Trooping the Color, reading the parade like a language. James looked down at his hands, They were steady. The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and floor polish. A nurse looked up as he came through the doors, and for just a moment her face registered surprise. A man in full ceremonial uniform, bearskin under his arm, walking with the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly where he is going. Then she recognized something in his expression, something that had nothing to do with the uniform, and she simply pointed down the corridor without being asked. The room was small and bright. His mother was sitting in the chair beside the bed, and when she saw him in the doorway she pressed her hand to her mouth and looked away for a moment. His father was in the bed, connected to a monitor, looking smaller than James had ever seen him look. His color was not good, but his eyes were open. James walked in and stood at the foot of the bed. Robert Whitmore looked at his son for a long moment. He took in the uniform, the tunic, the boots, the bearskin, all of it. And then something happened that the nurse standing just outside the door would later describe, quietly and with great care, to anyone who asked. The old soldier tried to sit up straighter. It was an instinct. Decades deep, built into the body by years of service, it rose up before thought could intervene. He could not manage it fully, he was too weak, and his hands were not cooperating, but the movement was unmistakable. His chin lifted. His shoulders drew back a fraction. His eyes, which had been soft with exhaustion, sharpened briefly into something that looked very much like pride. James went to his father's side and sat down in the chair his mother had just quietly vacated. He took his father's hand in both of his. "Did it go well?" his father asked. His voice was thin but clear. "It went well," James said. His father nodded. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, some of the tension had left his face. James sat with him, and for the first time since the night before, he let his composure ease. Not break, it was not that kind of moment, but ease. The way a tightly held thing can be held more gently when the moment has passed and the work is done. A family friend who had come to visit that afternoon saw them together through the small window in the door, the young soldier still in his scarlet tunic, sitting beside his father's bed. She took a photograph, not out of any intent to share it, but simply because she felt the need to hold the image in some form. Later, she sent it to a cousin with a brief message explaining what it meant. The cousin forwarded it to a friend. Within a week, it had reached corners of the internet that neither the family friend nor James Whitmore nor his father had ever heard of. Within 2 weeks, it had been seen by millions. The messages that came in were extraordinary in their volume and their sincerity. Veterans wrote. Nurses wrote. People who had watched the coronation from their living rooms and had seen the brief television shot of the soldier with the tightened jaw wrote to say that something about the image of him at his father's bedside had made them understand what they had been watching all day. Not the gold coach, not the ceremony, not the ancient tradition of a nation performing its history in public. A son doing his job so that his father could be proud of him, and then going to his father. James gave one statement to his regiment's press officer, and through him to the journalists who had come asking. It was short and it was careful and it was very much in his own voice. He said that he did not consider his choice remarkable. He said that his father had served and his grandfather before that. He said that duty was not something he had to think about. It was simply the language his family had always spoken. He thanked the people who had written. He said no more than that. Robert Whitmore spent 11 days in the hospital. His recovery was slow but steady, and the doctors who had been cautious on that first night became, in the weeks that followed, quietly optimistic. By Christmas he was home. By February he was sitting in his usual chair in the front room, watching a documentary about the coronation, pointing out things James had not noticed while he was riding beside the coach. The drawer in the kitchen remained exactly as it had always been. But sometime in the new year, James noticed that a new photograph had been added to it. A small printed copy of the image taken in the hospital room, him in his scarlet tunic, his father's hand in his, tucked behind the older photographs but not hidden. He did not mention it, neither did his father. Some things are understood between people who share a language that has no words for what matters most. In the spring, the regiment announced that Corporal Whitmore's unit had been selected as standard-bearer for the next ceremonial occasion. No announcement was made about why. No speech was given. In the quiet internal culture of the household division, where the highest acknowledgments are often the ones made without ceremony, the choice itself was the message. James received the news on a Thursday morning, read it once, folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket. That evening he called his father. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. The weather, a program his father had watched, a problem with the garden wall that his mother wanted fixed. At the end of the call, just before hanging up, his father said, as if it had just occurred to him, "Your grandfather would have liked to see you that day, with the coach." James said, "I know." There was a pause of about 3 seconds, comfortable, familiar, the kind of pause that has its own meaning. Then his father said, "Good night, son." And James said, "Good night, Dad." And that was all, that was enough, that in the end was everything.